Everyone, welcome to week 2 of what I'm calling Verbal Viscera. This is where I'm going to read one of my short stories and record it here and for the world to take note of or hate or reject or whatever. Uh, this story this week is coming from my collection American Guignol right here. As you can see behind me, the cover is right up there. It's available from Source Point Press. And the story this week is called Trevor and the Box of 64. Language has not been mitigated, so sensitive ears, tune out. Trevor Goldman hated the fact that his best friend was dead. More than that, he hated the fact that his best friend was dead and that it was cancer. How many 9-year-olds die of cancer? That was a question that Trevor asked himself over and over again. He asked Mr. Buck, his 4th grade teacher, and Mr. Buck refused to answer, or he didn't know. Whatever the number, Billy Simmons was dead, and Trevor felt like the world opened and swallowed him up. Everything was empty. His legs felt hollow, and his memories just rattled around in an empty head with nothing to pull them together and make the short life of Billy Simmons real to Trevor again. It was now the tail end of the summer, a full 2 months after Billy had died. Trevor was at a Cub Scout picnic, and the loss was weighing on him heaviest of all. Billy and Trevor were usually inseparable during the summer. For the past 2 months, Trevor had tried to do the things alone that Billy and he would do together. Playing catch before the Tigers game didn't really work out too well without a partner. Throwing water balloons at cars off of the viaduct over the highway wasn't nearly as fun without someone to laugh with. And this picnic was no exception. Both Billy and Trevor were planning on getting their bear rank together, but ever since Billy, Trevor had lost the desire to advance. Everything was just different now. Trevor was different too. He could feel it. He wasn't sure what had changed inside him, but something changed and he was angry. Angrier than he had ever been before. Angrier than the time that Lenny Marks pushed Trevor down and called him a four-eyed Jew. Inadvertently, Trevor smiled at the thought. The Lenny Marks story ended with Billy, a full 12 inches shorter than the twice held back Marks, landing the perfect punch on Lenny's greasy, bulbous nose and causing it to bloom in a crimson flower. Man, Billy could throw a punch. Trevor's smile faded with the memory. Not anymore, though. Billy was dead of cancer, and Trevor was alone. Trevor's dad had been the one to tell him. He picked Trevor up from school on a Wednesday, which is for sure because it was chicken nuggets for lunch. Trevor's dad almost never picked him up. It was usually his mom. So Trevor was pretty happy to see his father sidle up to the curb in the family station wagon. Trevor jumped in, threw his backpack to the rear, and turned. The look on his dad's face was one that Trevor would never forget. He was gray. Literally, his dad's face was the color of cigarette ash, and Trevor knew that something was really, really wrong. Trevor's mind jumped to conclusion after conclusion. Awful, terrible scenarios running rampant, showing Trevor flashes of awfulness in 3D. Trevor's brain landed on one of the images that seemed the most logical, and he instantly teared up. Did Grandpa die? Trevor asked his father. Unprepared for that particular question, Trevor's dad answered automatically, without thinking. No, Billy did. He responded and knew instantly he had made a mistake. Before the message could even register with Trevor, his dad reached over and pulled the young boy into a tight embrace. Trevor's eyes welled up with tears, and if he thought back real hard, the anger started there, right at that moment. Trevor and his father sat in the car for a long time, hugging and rocking back and forth. Trevor wept quietly into his father's ribcage, and his dad could only repeat, "I'm sorry, buddy," over and over again. Trevor was never quite sure whether or not his father was sorry that his son had lost his best friend, or if he screwed up delivering the message. Either way, Trevor sat and rocked for as long as he could. He knew that when the rocking and crying stopped, the real sadness would start. The wake had been particularly difficult. Trevor's mother and father pretty much planned it and helped to carry it out, even though Billy wasn't Jewish. That was cool. Billy's parents couldn't stop crying. All day they would look at pictures of Billy and sob real loud. This wasn't anything close to hurting your leg or not getting some kind of treat sob, Trevor noticed, but an honest-to-goodness, life-shaking sob. That is all he could think of to call it. Billy's mom's small body would quake with the pain and anguish of it all. Every time she looked at Trevor, she would make a small sound, a broken sound, and then her body would shudder. Grandpa, who took Trevor to the wake, told him that Trevor wasn't making her sad, but it was the memory of how much Billy loved Trevor that made her sad. Trevor was fine with it after a minute, since that meant that he could help her remember Billy even better. Trevor would never forget his best friend, that's for sure. Grandpa was the only adult that tried to explain things. When everyone else ignored the question or told Trevor that it takes time, Grandpa tried to help. He used to be a rabbi, or still was. Trevor was never quite sure if the title went away when someone retired, if it was like calling the president long after they had stopped being the president. Regardless, Grandpa did his best. How come some kids get cancer? Trevor had asked. Grandpa thought for a very long time, and Trevor assumed he would say something about God's will or something like that. Grandpa surprised him. Sometimes, Trevor, the spirit of a person is much stronger than the body God gave him. When that happens, the body just cannot contain the person, and he needs to go back to God, to heaven, when we can see him after we pass on. Trevor smiled, knowing deep down that Grandpa didn't know, but appreciated the fact that he tried to answer. This was at the beginning of the summer, before Grandpa got sick. Trevor couldn't remember a more awful summer in all of his life. Trevor spent quite a bit of time alone that summer. Grandpa was sick, so his mother was always trying to take care of things for him. She didn't mind, and it was easier when they moved Grandpa into the upstairs bedroom next to Trevor's. Grandpa was real sick, though, and things weren't normal like they used to be. Grandpa wasn't normal. Oftentimes, he would call Trevor into his room and talked about dark things. Sometimes he would talk to himself for hours in Hebrew, which Trevor had always had trouble with. Trevor knew, though, that it was just Grandpa's body giving up on his spirit and trying to remember the good times, like he tried to remember the good times with Billy. It was hard, though, and Trevor's pillow would be soaked in tears as often as it was dry that summer. Trevor didn't know it yet, but the tears would be gone after the Cub Scout picnic, replaced by something else. The picnic would never be the same without Billy, and soon, nothing would ever be the same again. The picnic had started out as well as it could be expected. He lurked around the adults' table, avoiding all efforts by his fellow scouts to engage him in some ridiculous knot-tying competition or another. Mr. Weaver, the scoutmaster, didn't notice Trevor on the fringes of the conversation. Neither did Trevor's dad or the other adults. Trevor wouldn't have noticed them if it weren't for, "That's what they said about Billy, all right," one of them said. Trevor's ears perked up, and he bolted for the nearby shadows of the bushes instinctively. He was a kid, and kids knew that the minute they were spotted, the interesting conversation stopped. This was important. It was about Billy, and Trevor had a right to know. The adults spoke in hushed tones, as if this were some sort of dirty secret. Trevor couldn't make out who was speaking. His vantage point in the bushes wouldn't allow it, but what he heard was important enough. "They tell me the diagnosis was late or something like that." "What?" "They caught it too late. Billy had a checkup 6 months prior and they missed something." "No, that's murder." I wouldn't go that far, Leo." "Well, I would. Medical murder. Those doctors killed that kid through negligence." Trevor's vision clouded over. He heard the words, but processing them, that was something different. Murder. Doctors. Billy. Murdered? Negligent? Trevor swooned and caught himself before falling. Luckily, though, there was a little spark, a flame, in the back of his head. Way back where the real thoughts are, that started to cut through the cloud. That spark grew, fanned by the conversation Trevor had just heard. The flame soon erupted into a fireball, swirling in his head, consuming rational thought like kindling. Trevor wanted nothing more than to scream out in anguish, let the world know that he burned with hate and vengeance and revenge. He was a kid, though, and had nowhere to let that fire loose aside from inside his own head. Trevor sat there the rest of the picnic and smoldered. He bunched the screaming and the anguish and fire together, and he held it close. He held it very close. Not even his father or his mother could tell. Trevor went home, did his chores, and finally brought Grandpa's dinner upstairs. Grandpa, though, had seen hell. Grandpa still had numbers tattooed on his arm from when he was a small boy that Trevor's dad promised to tell him about one day. Grandpa had seen hell and recognized it in the eyes of his grandson. Trevor set the tray down in front of his grandfather and turned to leave, like normal, when the old man called him back. "Trevor, son?" He sounded different. Trevor turned. "Yes, sir?" "Let me see your eyes, boy." The request was odd, but things had been getting odder and odder with Grandpa lately. Trevor stood before his grandfather, staring into the cloudy hazel eyes of the old rabbi. "You're burning up inside." Trevor, shocked, had to answer. "Yes, sir." "What's it about?" Trevor shook his head. He couldn't go into it. Giving voice to it would let it out, and he could literally be consumed by the rage. "Feels too big, like it'll burn your face off if you say it," Grandpa said. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. Trevor nodded. "Someone needs to pay. Justice needs to be done. That's obvious." Grandpa said these things to himself mostly, but he glanced at Trevor. Grandpa smiled funny just then. Not kind and not happy, just pleased. Quicker than Trevor thought the old man could move, he had his arm around the boy, pulling him in. Grandpa leaned in close to Trevor's ear. "There's a way, Trevor. There's a way to make them all pay," Grandpa said. Trevor stood there, afraid to move. Grandpa was scaring him half to death, but even the smallest bit of information that could help him to release this burning would be worth it. He stared forward, eyes wide, as Grandpa continued. "You have to want it, though. You have to need it and not care what happens next. You have to be willing to give up everything because that is what it takes. Can you do that?" Trevor, without hesitating, nodded. Grandpa cackled. He leaned in close, his whiskers brushing Trevor's ear. "There's a way, Trevor, and only we can do it. Rabbis and their sons. We can be justice when justice has forsaken our people. We can be vengeance. We can burn them like we burn if we know the name." Trevor, afraid to even move his eyes, managed to squeak out, "What name?" "The true name, boy, the true name. Do you want this? Do you want them to suffer for what they've done?" Every rational part of Trevor screamed, "No, please, no." But the rational parts of Trevor also smoldered like white-hot charcoal. Grandpa had a way, a special way, and Trevor wanted Billy back more than anything. He knew that couldn't happen. So if Billy couldn't be here, neither could the people that killed him. They said murdered. "Yes, Grandpa." Grandpa cackled again and clapped his hands together. "This is about your Goyim friend, no?" Trevor nodded. Grandpa smiled in return. "Good. Bring me something. Bring me things that we can build with. Something you shared. We need to make an instrument of destruction, Trevor. Clay or mud or anything. Go. Now." Trevor smiled. He knew exactly what Grandpa needed and bolted from the room. Trevor burst into his own room and headed straight for the closet. He had stuffed the half-started projects in a small box and shoved them in the closet. Trevor slid the box labeled, "With Billy," out from underneath the new school clothes and threw the lid to the side. He plunged his hands in, pulling out a pile of Legos and a well-used box of crayons, the 64 count. He set them to the side and fished in again, removing 2 fish hooks and a pink ribbon, stowed in the box after a failed attempt at making homemade fishing lures. The rest of the box was filled with comic books, drawings, and various pieces of paperwork. Trevor scanned the items and reasoned that Grandpa, if anyone, would find these useful. Trevor scooped them up and burst back through his bedroom doors. Trevor tumbled into Grandpa's room and fell to his knees, dumping the loot at Grandpa's slippered feet. With a great effort, Grandpa joined Trevor on the floor and poked through the materials. Grandpa smiled, looking Trevor in the eye. "Good, boy, good. We start now. We make a man tonight. We make a man that gives our rage life." Grandpa immediately dumped the crayons onto the floor and began the process of taking the paper wrappings off. Trevor, watching intently, followed along. Once the crayons had been shucked, Grandpa sent Trevor off for a large candle, like the kind Trevor's mother always had on the dining room table. Trevor returned with one, the ugly gold star that both he and his father thought was very, very ugly, and a lighter. Grandpa dumped his dinner from a ceramic plate onto the serving tray and piled the crayons there. After lighting the candle, he held the plate over the candle, slowly heating them up. Grandpa motioned for Trevor to take the plate. Trevor, take the plate. Be careful. We don't want them to melt. We just want to be able to sculpt, create. Trevor, transfixed with the process and his grandpa's new personality, did as he was told. Grandpa turned his attention to the remaining items. He stared at the Legos for a long time before suddenly recognizing that they fit together. Piecing each of them together one at a time, Grandpa fashioned a crude skeleton. There weren't many Legos in the box. Trevor and Billy tended to lose pieces to things, but the skeleton stood roughly 10 inches tall. Grandpa turned to examine the crayons over the plate. He plunged his finger in, seeing how pliable the waxy crayon material was. He nodded to Trevor. Almost there. Trevor smiled. They were silent, but spoke volumes in the small room. Working by 40-watt soft light, Grandpa took the plate from Trevor. Carefully, as if he were tending to fragile flowers, Grandpa began to apply the crayon material around the Lego skeleton. Picking up on the cue after watching for a moment, Trevor followed suit. The way was slow going. The crayon material would cool quickly and would need to be reheated. In the middle of the process, Trevor had to fake a bedtime and sneak back into Grandpa's room to continue. Trevor was tired at the end, his eyelids were heavy, and only his anger, that flame, kept him going. Finally, just after 3 a.m, the figure that Trevor had christened the Melty Man was complete. Trevor and Grandpa stood back, regarding the Melty Man. He doesn't look too, I don't know, Trevor began. Strong? Sturdy? Yeah. Grandpa laughed again. We're far from done, Trevor. The boy peered closer. The Lego skeleton was covered in a thin skin of multicolored crayons. He was pretty. Trevor would give him that. The rainbow colors blending, veins of blue and brown, red right hand and yellow left. It came together like one of those paintings we'd have made in first grade. The squared head wrapped around the Lego skull featured a large mouth. It was mostly yellow. Grandpa, being a little more skilled, had even fashioned jagged crayon teeth in the Melty Man's mouth. This is just the start. Tomorrow we begin again, Grandpa said. Grandpa smiled, and for a minute, it was old Grandpa. The old man gently turned Trevor toward the door and pushed him out. He hated to admit it, but Trevor was grateful. Exhausted, Trevor fell into bed and slept like the dead. The burning flickered in his dreams, though, and Trevor woke earlier than usual for a Saturday. He jumped from his bed and, after taking care of an annoyingly long morning pee, softly rapped on Grandpa's door. Come, was the response. Trevor entered. Grandpa sat on the edge of this bed, waiting for Trevor as if he had never slept. The Melty Man lay on the floor, looking as he did the night before, aside from a small piece of paper in its mouth. It may have been the morning or the lack of sleep or Trevor's skewed perception, but Grandpa almost glowed. Seriously, he smiled wide like that guy at the carnival last year that convinced Trevor to spend all of his money throwing useless softball after useless softball and milk cans. Trevor didn't know what that meant, but returned Grandpa's weird smile with one of his own. Grandpa motioned toward the Melty Man, and both he and Trevor kneeled, one on either side of their new creation. What's the paper for? Trevor asked. That, my boy, is how we make it live, Grandpa answered. Like the great Rabbi Judalo ben Bezal, who defended the poor of Prague against anti-Semites, we shall avenge the death of your friend. Grandpa had become very animated here, and it threw Trevor off, but only for a moment. Trevor knew that Billy's death was no twist of fate, no coincidence. The adults said he was murdered, and that doctors did it. So the Melty Man would do the job for them. Grandpa pushed the note further into the Melty Man's mouth with his little finger. He extended his hands over the figurine and indicated that Trevor should grasp. Trevor did so, and Grandpa smiled again. Good, Trevor, good. Today, our friend has in its mouth the Hebrew word for truth, which is? Grandpa waited, head cocked. Trevor understood Hebrew about as well as he threw left-handed. "I don't know, Grandpa," Trevor said. Grandpa's brow scrunched, but it appeared as if he expected this. On the paper is written, Emet. 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 Truth. Oh, right, sorry. Grandpa sighed. "Close your eyes as I speak and think of your friend. Think of justice and, most importantly, think of the guilty. It is that fire that will bring our little friend, our golem, to life." Trevor nodded. Although he understood the term golem, he had never equated it to a thing before. He pushed the thought out and concentrated on the important issues. Trevor had only met Billy's main doctor once, but that was enough. There were more, though. The nurses, the funeral man that made Billy look so fake, the town that only pretended to care. All of them deserved it. Mr. Buck, who had no answers. Lee Marks, because he probably wanted Billy to die. All of them. All of them should burn, burn, burn. Grandpa began to mumble something as Trevor pressed his eyes shut, holding them clamped down. He held them tight like he was trying to fuse his eyelids together. Grandpa's voice deepened and the words, obviously Hebrew, roughened. Grandpa's voice changed to Trevor. After a full minute of chanting, Trevor didn't keep his eyes shut solely to concentrate. He was afraid of what he would see. All the while, Grandpa's hands got warmer and warmer. The chanting continued. Trevor smashed his eyes shut and Grandpa's hands felt like they were on fire. And then it was over. Grandpa's hands, sweaty, slipped out from Trevor's. The mumbling ceased. Cautiously, Trevor peeked open one eye, and after letting it adjust to the bright light, Trevor looked down. The melty man was gone. Trevor, smiling, looked up. "Grandpa, the melty..." Trevor stopped short. His heart crept into his throat, and he kneeled, stunned. Grandpa had slumped backwards from his kneeling position into an awkward sort of yoga position, his head pressed against the bedside table with the corner of the little lamp stand digging into the side. Grandpa's face was white, almost pure white, and his eyes bulged from his head. He stared straight forward, right at Trevor. Grandpa was dead, and he smiled at Trevor like that carnival barker did when Trevor turned out his empty pockets. Trevor slowly stood, unable to tear his eyes away from Grandpa. He backed toward the bedroom door. Someone had to tell his mother and father. The melty man was gone, and Grandpa used what strength he had to make it happen. Grandpa's spirit was willing, but it was like Billy. Trevor had felt for the past few days that he was empty of tears. He couldn't cry anymore. It just wasn't possible. He was wrong. Sniffling, Trevor wiped his eyes with his pajama sleeve and went to find his father. Eileen Richardson stormed through the hallways of the Livingston Medical Center. She adjusted her nurse's uniform and wondered why, on God's green earth, she continued screwing Dr. James, stuck up his conceited ass, Anderson. Yes, he was charming when he wanted to be. He was definitely handsome. He was a doctor to boot. Eileen reached her station and slammed her hands on the table, palms first, out of frustration. See, every time you can rationalize anything, she said to no one in particular. It was 9 o'clock in the morning and things had been pretty slow. Check in on Dr. Anderson. He's working a double and looks stressed out. One thing leads to another, and boom, Eileen is ass over heels and the good doctor is relieved of all that ails him. And then, just like always, Eileen is dismissed with a wave of the hand and all is right with the world. Just like always, Eileen swears that was the last time until the next time. Just like always. Lost in her own issues, Eileen Richardson, RN, didn't notice a small blur of color dart past her, hugging the wall. If she did, she would probably have attributed what she saw to post-coitus fatigue or some crap like that. Eileen took a deep breath, gathered herself, and began to mentally write the speech she would deliver to Dr. Anderson. After all, small, brightly colored rainbow men do not sneak around hospitals. Usually. James Anderson lounged on the couch in the medical center's faculty lounge. He smiled to himself and stretched out. Small town, pretty nurses, God complex, it all went hand in hand. This was the life they talked about in medical school, and a large reason why James chose to specialize and become a pediatrician. As a doctor dealing in pediatric cancers, Anderson was relatively well respected. As a human being, known only to those closest to him, he was a near failure. This alone could explain Dr. Anderson's satisfaction with demoralizing and dehumanizing that nurse. What's her name? Eileen? Ellen? It didn't matter. This time, it wouldn't matter next time. Anderson stretched his back and put his arms behind his head. Today was going to be a good day. Lost in his reverie, the good doctor, but bad human, did not notice the swinging doors to the faculty lounge part slightly. He did not notice the pit-pat of clay on tile and was only dimly aware of his left pant leg moving up. Anderson became acutely aware of the sharp, biting pain in his ankle, though. He shot up right with a start, screaming out in pain. He looked toward his ankle to see what could only be described as a child's figurine from some monster or space movie latched onto his ankle. It was multicolored, like a lollipop swirl. Its skin stretched tight over a blocky frame. It was small and deceptively powerful. This thing moved, and it moved fast. Anderson screamed out again as the thing, complete with a nasty-looking fishhook protruding from its hand, ripped into his Achilles tendon, severing it on the third or fourth try. Anderson tried to kick the thing off, but its other hand had a similar fishhook protruding from the forearm and hooked into the leather upper of his sensible doctor's shoes. Unable to lose the little fiend, Anderson fell off of the faculty couch onto his stomach. He tried to crawl forward, but the pain of his severed tendon and the massing pool of blood at his feet made moving quickly a near impossibility. The fiend swung itself up with supernatural agility. As Anderson struggled, the little thing reared back and dug the fishhook again and again into the back of the doctor's leg until the other Achilles tendon succumbed to the furious onslaught. Howling in pain, the doctor scrabbled forward, trying to evade the ferocious little beast. No matter how Anderson struggled, the forward progress of the thing never ceased. Using the fishhooks, it climbed, for lack of a better term, up Anderson's back, taking small, excruciating chunks of flesh out with each thrust. Anderson's legs flailed, and he managed another choked scream as the melty man hooked into each of the doctor's ears. Rearing back, controlling the doctor's head like a bucking horse, the doctor's neck stretched backward. With inhuman speed, the melty man ripped free of the doctor's ears and literally fish-hooked the sides of his mouth, pulling Anderson's face into a red-flared, grotesque grin. The sides of Anderson's face slowly split under the pressure, tearing large gorges into his cheeks. Swinging back around, the melty man faced Anderson. The doctor's eyes were wide with fear and his mouth agape. Moving unnaturally quick again, the melty man was inside Anderson's mouth like a shot. Using the fishhooks, he disappeared down the doctor's gullet whole, as if the man was a python swallowing a technicolor rat. Anderson flipped onto his back and clutched at his throat, chest, abdomen, tracing the progress of the melty man, when the door to the faculty lounge burst open. Eileen stood in the doorway, hands on her hips, and haloed by the light of the hallway. James, I don't think that it's right. James? The doctor, prone on the floor, feebly clutched at his abdomen. Eileen noticed the growing pool of blood and stepped back. She quickly regained her composure and, training kicked in to beat back the fight instinct, she moved forward and knelt next to Anderson. James, can you speak? Can you hear me? The doctor turned to her, eyes wide. He whimpered a bit, the vocal cords being one of the first casualties, and pointed to his abdomen. Eileen, a bit fearful even with her years in trauma, opened the doctor's coat and unbuttoned his dress shirt. James Alexander was not the type of person, even in great pain or under a huge amount of stress, to show any kind of weakness, and this worried her. She opened his shirt and nearly retched at what she saw. His abdomen was already turning purplish, bleeding from within. Eileen was used to internal bleeding. It was the moment, however, that caused the bile to rise in her throat. The movement, however, that caused the bile to rise in her throat. The squirming, just under the surface of James' skin, sent a convulsive shiver down Eileen's spine. Like roadkill, she couldn't help but look at as James' abdomen stretched forward as if his perpetual erection had moved inside. The skin of his stomach stretched upward like canvas on a tent pole. James squealed in pain, but Eileen ignored him. She was transfixed, hypnotized by what was happening in front of her. Eileen stared so intently at the moving, roving abdomen that the sound of meat splitting, the spatter of blood, and James's shrieking took her a moment to process. When she had processed the gory sequence, she fell backward, mouth agape, at the newest horror. Dripping with the viscera of the last man she slept with, the melty man stood before Eileen. It lifted its rainbow arms, complete with bloody hooks, to the sky, and the thing literally roared, louder than the small frame could possibly produce, at Eileen. On her backside, she scooted toward the opposite wall, her whimpering reminiscent of James before his untimely demise, punctuated the scrabbling of her sensible nurses' souls on the linoleum. The thing, the melty man, leapt down from the good doctor and moved toward the dutiful nurse. It moved like a flash. Eileen barely had time to yell out in agony and wet herself before the golem was tearing into body. Barely disturbing the hem of her uniform, the melty man entered Nurse Eileen through the easiest accessible route. He rummaged around inside of her, all hooks and gnashing of supernaturally powerful jaws. From Eileen's exterior, it appeared like she was having a hyper-violent grand mal seizure. She flipped and flopped on the cold floor, back and forth, traveling a long enough distance to splash in James' cooling puddles of blood. This would, of course, wreak havoc for the crime scene investigators. As Eileen succumbed to her eternal wounds, the melty man rested inside her butchered womb. The next phase of the revenge required a short road trip. Trevor stood in his Sunday best. He clutched his father's hand as they walked toward the casket at the end of the hallway. Trevor looked up at his father, who sniffled, stifling back tears. And Trevor smiled and squeezed his father's hand. Trevor had been to this place before for Billy, and Billy's casket was open, which was something new for Trevor. He had been to no less than 2 funerals prior to this one, his aunt and grandma making him an expert. He remembered standing before Billy's body and just knowing that Billy would hate this. He looked fake and waxy, like an action figure. Trevor hadn't been allowed to see his friend before the end. His parents agreed with Billy's parents about that, and Trevor still harbored some enmity about it. So Billy's visage came as a shock lying there in the small cherry wood casket. All Trevor wanted to do was scream and cry and shove that coffin over so Billy could get up and they would run away from all of them. Trevor knew it was improbable. Anything was possible, so he didn't. He just stood there, stifling a good old cry like his dad was doing right now. So Grandpa's funeral could only be better. Trevor looked up to his father again. He wanted nothing more than to tell him that Grandpa's spirit was just too big. He wanted to tell his father that they had done together and that Billy will finally have some justice. Trevor wanted to make his father feel better, and knowing that Grandpa had passed on in the pursuit of that justice. Trevor said Grandpa had done something very, very special, and it was the most difficult thing in the world for a 10-year-old boy to keep that secret. Trevor and his father walked past the rows and rows of grieving family and friends. Grandpa was an important man, and Trevor had never seen the synagogue so incredibly full. The casket was closed, of course, as Trevor and his father approached. Even though Jewish tradition forbids displaying the body to funeral goers, the grin that Grandpa had died with did not fade. Some, like Trevor's father, found it disturbing. Trevor knew otherwise. After a brief stop at the casket, Trevor and his father turned and retreated down the aisle. It was Trevor's father's duty to dismiss the rows of attendees and inform them that Shiva would begin this evening at the family home. Trevor was only dimly aware of the concept. He understood that for the next 7 days there would be visitors to their house in honor of Grandpa. Trevor liked that. After the funeral, Trevor's parents took their position in the living room as guest after guest poured into the house. Trevor had never seen it so busy, not even that time that Grandpa retired. Trevor snacked on the mountains of food that people brought and moved through the house, catching bits and pieces of conversations. He stopped short, though. Ripped apart, apparently. Dr. Alexander at the hospital? Terrible. My cousin is an EMT, and he said that it looked like an animal had gotten in. Trevor recognized the name, Alexander. He thought that was the name of Billy's doctor, but didn't know for sure. Grandpa had assured him, though, that the melty man would know. The melty man would find everyone that escaped justice, everyone that Trevor believed to be responsible for Billy's death. He didn't even need to know their names. He just had to have that fire in his head, fueling the melty man, and their creation would do the rest. Trevor moved into the corner and peeked out. A large woman, Mrs. Rosenbaum, he thought, was talking to a small woman whose name Trevor couldn't remember. Mrs. Rosenbaum's cousin was an EMT. His name was Lyle, and he volunteered at the baseball games. An animal inside the hospital? Mm-hmm, Mrs. Rosenbaum returned. She looked very pleased that she could be sharing this news. And what's worse is that somehow the animal got to Dr. Alexander's nurse, too. Both of them dead. Dead as doornails. Wow. Trevor turned away from them, smiling from ear to ear. The flame still burned bright. Doyle Travinsky of Travinsky Brothers Funeral Home slumped outside at the rear of the building. The large white structure had been in the Travinsky family for many, many years, and Doyle, along with his slightly older brother, had spent a majority of their lives prepping, primping, and presenting the dead. The Rabbi Goldman service had ended, and Doyle took a long drag from his cigarette as he waited for the day's next chore. Go ahead and suck on your coffin nail, Theodore, older brother and nag, had told Doyle. We got that doctor and the nurse coming in for prep. As Doyle left the building, the coffin nail was a not-so-inside joke, and the brothers often laughed about who would prepare whom when the time came. They were very close and always had been. The brothers were barely a year apart, and due to the nature of the family business, grew up shunned by the rest of the community. That was all right by them, though, since they preferred their own company. Trained by their father and grandfather from a very young age, it was a foregone conclusion that the brothers would take over the funeral home at some point. That point came far too soon for the boys' liking when Doyle turned 30, and the next 25 years had gone by quickly. Both of them unmarried and childless, the extended future of the funeral home was in doubt. Doyle looked down at his coffin nail and giggled to himself. He would often think that, for a guy that had seen the effects of lung cancer on a regular basis, he made some piss-poor decisions. With a grunt, Doyle took a last drag as the coroner's van pulled into the lot. Reaching behind him, Doyle banged on the large loading doors, and the aluminum rattled like thunder. Teddy, open up. He's making a house call, Doyle shouted out. Laughing at his own joke, Doyle directed the van backwards. Teddy appeared from the opening door, and they loaded the doctor and nurse into the washdown area. After the brothers had hosed down the corpses, the real extent of the doctor's injuries were evident. The large, gaping hole in his abdomen aside, the multiple abrasions and cuts along his legs, including the Achilles tendons, announced to the pair that this was a most unusual case of death. What concerned them the most, though, was the jester-like grin permanently cut into the doctor's face. His mother demands an open casket, Doyle announced. Seriously? Seriously. Shit. That being the extent of the brothers' conversation during the entire process, they moved to the nurse. From the exterior, the nurse appeared nearly alive and in good health. They knew, though, that a great deal of internal bleeding had killed her. The brothers had worked together for so long they rarely felt the need to communicate formally. Silently, they turned from the nurse and headed toward the makeshift kitchen they had put together for breaks. If there were a whistle that only morticians could hear, it just blew and announced a lunch break. The boys exited. No sooner did they leave the room when the nurse's corpse shifted. Not much, but it moved. It lifted a little bit from the lower back area. A beat and another little spasm. The nude corpse of the nurse twitched and her legs moved apart slightly. Another twitch, a little more movement. More twitching, a minor arch of the back, and the nurse's legs were spread wide enough to expose her genitals to whomever may be looking. No one was in the room, of course, so no one could see the small, multicolored arm peek out from the nurse's vagina. The fishhooks had been retracted, and the first arm was followed by a second. The melty man spread the nurse's labia back and stepped out of her vagina, shaking off the remnants of her viscera that still clung to his small frame. The melty man surveyed the room quickly and turned in the direction the brothers had headed for. He leapt from the table, beelining after the sibling morticians. Trevor followed his father back into the funeral home. The day's events over, his father needed to pick up the materials that the family had left after the funeral service. There was the large board with photos of Grandpa through the years, including the embarrassing one where Grandpa gave Trevor a bath, but Trevor didn't feel too ashamed about it after today. Some of the flowers and Grandpa's stuff from the inside the casket. Trevor's dad was a little vague about that stuff, but asked if Trevor was feeling all right and if he would help. Trevor, stunned, could only nod his head. He almost started to cry and really wished that Grandpa were there so he could tell him. His dad had asked Trevor to do something, not told, not commanded. He asked for an opinion and a favor, and Trevor's answer was the sole authority on the subject. It was a whole new world. So they entered the funeral home, and Trevor noted, whether it was teeming with people or completely empty, there was a pervasive silence that seemed to always be around. "Hello, Doyle?" Trevor's dad called out. There was no answer. His dad turned to him and smiled weakly with a shrug of the shoulders. Maybe they took a break. Trevor shrugged back. Without a word, though, he slipped his hand into his father's. Something didn't feel right. Trevor's dad wasn't surprised and grasped his son's hand. Together they moved forward through the dimly lit funeral home. Eventually, the glow of a light drew them in. As they approached the light, the smell of microwave lasagna, sickly sweet and perpetually burnt, wafted through the area. "We were right. Lunch break," Trevor's dad said. The duo entered the small, brightly lit kitchen and stopped short. Both Trevor and his father stood before the scene of a slaughter. Doyle and Theodore, or what was left of them, were seated on the floor. They appeared to be hugging one another like some sort of homage to a baby picture from 50 years earlier. Each of their heads lolled, one to the left and one to the right, and was a mass of lacerations. It was impossible to discern which brother was which. The faces appeared to be removed, but the amount of blood obscured anything. Moving like he waded through water, Trevor's father scooped him up and turned Trevor's head to the side. He held the son against his shoulder, not allowing his son to turn back and see the carnage. Trevor had seen enough, though. He saw the men, and he saw that they were missing their faces. Sinewy red muscle glistened from underneath the blood and the ragged cuts on the forehead. Cheeks and chin indicated that something sharp, but not designed for cutting, had ripped through that flesh. Trevor knew what had made those cuts. He knew what had taken the faces of those men. Trevor's breathing came in heaving gasps, and he shuddered, unable to control his body. Trevor's dad hugged him closer as Trevor sobbed. From the corner of his eye, Trevor saw a multicolored blur move toward the front doors. He was sure that the Melty Man was responsible. Trevor was also sure that if the Melty Man was responsible, that he was responsible. The fire that burned in Trevor winked out instantly. It was snuffed the moment he saw his own handiwork, the results of his burning vengeance. Trevor's 10-year-old version of revenge could never truly comprehend the type of carnage that the Melty Man, the Golem, was created for. Trevor wanted these people to pay, but the price was horrific. Trevor pushed against his father's shoulder until the grief-stricken man let him down. Trevor knew he had to stop the Melty Man before he could visit anyone else. He wasn't sure who was next, but he had an idea. Trevor's dad, unable to tear himself away from the sight of Doyle and Theodore, barely acknowledged his son. "Dad, I gotta stop him, okay?" Trevor asked. His father, without turning, nodded. "We should get the police, shouldn't we?" "Yeah," Trevor answered. Stealing a quick glance at a wall clock, Trevor reasoned that the next target would be arriving home soon, and, from last year's Memorial Day party, he knew right where the target lived. Trevor headed out in pursuit. Finally acknowledging what his son had just said, Trevor's dad turned to find that he was the only living thing in the room. "Trevor? Trev?" Trevor ran through the gloomy suburban streets. A right on Rolling Brook, a left on Golden Meadows, and so on would take him to the site of last year's Memorial Day barbecue at Mr. Buck's home. Trevor ran, ignoring the stitch in his side, as the street lights started to blink on with an audible pop of electricity. The lamps lit a path for Trevor. He had noticed a few Halloweens ago, the last time he actually went trick-or-treating like a kid, that the street lamps never really lit anything up. They gave off this pool of light that spread out on the ground from the lamp pole, but it never quite made it to the next pool of light from the next lamp. That means there was this dark area, murky and dangerous, between the lights that everyone had to make it through in order to feel safe again. As Trevor ran, he was very conscious of this dark area, and each one seemed bigger than it did when he was a little kid. He pressed on, breathing in ragged gasps. He turned right on Bayview Ridge and beelined for the third house on the left. Trevor clambered up the porch and wasted no time in pounding on the front doors of the modest single-story ranch that looked just like the other modest single-story ranches on the street. Trevor only stopped pounding when he saw the hallway light turn inside on. The door swung open to reveal Mr. Buck in a bathrobe. His normally perfectly parted hair a shambled mess, his breaths coming in gasps like Trevor. Mr. Buck looked down in utter amazement. Trevor? Mr. Buck, are you all right? Trevor managed to breathe out. Mr. Buck looked around the yard for whoever else would be in on the joke. What is going on here, Trevor? He asked. Before Trevor could answer from inside Mr. Buck's home, a high-pitched male voice rang out. Who is it, Terry? Hurry up. Mr. Buck looked down at Trevor, his cheeks growing red. Look, Trevor, you need to get home right now, okay? Trevor nodded, catching his breath. Are you all right, Mr. Buck? Trevor, I'm not in the mood for... Mr. Buck began as he swung the door closed. Trevor threw himself in the way, physically blocking the door from closing. Hey, Mr. Buck, this is important. Is everything okay? Have you, seen anything strange? Mr. Buck's eyes softened. He kneeled. Trevor, I'm okay. My friend is okay. I know the past few months have been tough. If you need to talk, come see me in the morning. Trevor poked his head around Mr. Buck. He just knew the melty man would be here. Are you sure, Mr. Buck? He has to be here. He has to. Trevor tried pushing his way into the house, only to be stopped by the larger adult. Mr. Buck took Trevor by the shoulders and nearly lifted him out on the porch. Trevor, I think it is best if you go home. We'll talk about this in the morning, young man. With that, Mr. Buck shut the door in Trevor's face. Trevor turned, confused, and slumped on the porch. He knew the melty man would be there. He just knew it. Mr. Buck couldn't tell him why Billy had to die, and, Trevor was angry about that. Very angry. If the golem that he and Grandpa had created was anywhere, it should be here. Trevor looked up, the barest hint of a smile coming to his face. Could it be over? He stood and scanned the area. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, but everything at once. He searched his own head and determined that it was gone. He reached far back into that head as he could and determined that the flame was gone. It was out, and with it, Trevor reasoned, so was the melty man. Almost gleefully, Trevor stood and headed home. As Trevor neared his house, he noticed Billy's parents' car parked in the driveway. He felt a small pang of guilt, realizing that he must have caused quite a panic. His parents and the Simmons were still close, and Trevor figured that if he was missing, his parents would call their best friends first. Trevor entered through the front door, but what he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. The front room was awash in blood. The walls covered in crimson as if some brilliant abstract artist used them as a canvas. Trevor saw the pile of what can only be called meat at this point in the middle of the room. He recognized bits and pieces of his parents' clothing and his mother's pearl necklace among the carnage. Pieces here, pieces there, a hand, or a strip of thigh, or a part of face. Trevor wasn't quite sure what he was looking at. He knew that it was horrible, and he knew that his parents and Mr. and Mrs. Simmons were so cut and smashed and smushed together that no one would be able to tell them apart. And, before Trevor could even think to look for him, the melty man climbed to the top of the flesh pile with bloody, dripping hooks and jaws. The golem raised its brightly colored arms to the sky and roared, relishing in its victory. Its roar rang throughout the house and inside Trevor's head. The melty man bowed before Trevor, paying some kind of fealty to its master, even though Trevor's flame had burnt out, and even though Trevor believed that whatever vengeance he craved was sated. The melty man still had a mission. Trevor dropped to his knees, squishing into the small bits and pieces that had separated themselves from the large pile of adults. The melty man wiped his hooks on Trevor's mother's new rug. After cleaning, the melty man turned and walked through the front door, and Trevor just watched the golem go. The boy turned back to what remained of his and Billy's families. He knew why Mr. Buck was safe. He even knew why the melty man had come here. Everyone was to blame, all of them. The Simmons genes turned them into murderers for allowing Billy to develop the disease in the first place. His parents couldn't prevent Billy from dying. No one could. The Melty Man didn't care because Trevor didn't care. Trevor knew that the golem wouldn't stop until he was finished. He was born from hatred, an anger that burned so hot it could only have come from someone too young to recognize the consequences of that hate. Trevor grew up quickly as his parents pooled around his knees, and he realized that the Melty Man would be back soon enough because he hated himself most of all. And that's it. Trevor in the box of 64. I hope you enjoyed that one, guys. See you next week.